Good afternoon, Dunlake High. This is the Science Source here, ready to prepare you for the Biology HSA. As you recall, every student needs to pass the HSA to graduate from high school. One of the most heavily tested areas in the Biology HSA is the genetics unit. I am here to prepare you for your spring test. In order to start our investigation, we need to understand what is genetics. Genetics is the study of genes, heredity, and variation in traits. We can physically see genetics when we observe parents' similarities passed on their offspring. The passing of genes and traits from parents to offspring is known as heredity. Heredity is the passing of genes and traits from parents to those offspring. A main concept of genetics everyone needs to understand is that a single gene produces one single trait. For example, if you inherit the gene for, say, brown hair, you will display the trait brown hair. We are going to extend on this process and see specifically how this occurs. Then, we will practice a few HSA questions related to the concept of gene to trait.
Oh, science guy, what is a gene?
A gene is a segment of a double-stranded molecule known as DNA. Your complete DNA can be found stored inside the nucleus of every single cell that makes up our body. So, let's take a look back at this concept. So a gene equals DNA, and that DNA is going to cause some type of trait.
Science guy, DNA, what is that?
DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, is a double-stranded nucleic acid in the shape of a twisted ladder. It is the blueprint that codes for every single trait you have. DNA is made up of 4 nitrogen bases: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. We abbreviate those A, T, G, and C. In DNA, adenine will always bind to thymine, and guanine will always bind to cytosine. So we see this pattern of A's going to T's and G's going to C's. In order for us to display a trait such as our hair color, we need to create a protein from this DNA code. Once we make the protein, we will have the trait. So let's take a look back at that concept. So a gene equals DNA, and that DNA is going to help us create a protein. And once we make that protein, we will show a trait. We have a protein, however. The DNA in your cells will never, ever, ever leave the cell's nucleus. The DNA is protected inside the nucleus and much less likely to undergo a mutation when sheltered by the nucleus, the headquarters of the cell. In order to create a protein, we need to get this gene's DNA message to a ribosome, the protein builders of the cell. So to get this gene's message to the ribosome, we create a copy of that genetic recipe in the form of a single-stranded nucleic acid known as RNA. So let's take a look once more at this original concept. So a gene equals DNA. We're going to create an RNA copy, a message of that gene, to create this protein. And once we make that protein, we've shown that trait. So this is a phrase I want you to be comfortable with. This is an essential process to understand for the Biology HSA. So let's take one more look at these processes again. Where did we say DNA is stored inside the cell again?
The nucleus.
That's correct, the nucleus. So a gene equals DNA, and we create that RNA inside the nucleus. Well, inside the nucleus, a RNA copy of the DNA will be made through a process known as transcription. This recipe can leave the nucleus and will locate a ribosome outside the cell to complete the final step. So now, we see that gene being copied into RNA through transcription. Well, once we have reached that ribosome, this final step involves the ribosome taking that RNA message and creating a protein. This protein will then allow the expression of whatever trait the original gene was coding. Let's try an example. Imagine we had a gene for, again, brown hair. This segment of double-stranded DNA will undergo transcription inside the cell's nucleus to create a single-stranded copy of that gene. So this recipe Now, a single-stranded form has the freedom to leave the nucleus and locate a ribosome outside of that nucleus. Once bound to that ribosome, this RNA message will be translated into a fully functional protein, producing that brown hair trait. Success! Let's try a couple HSA questions related to genetics and see how you would do. What do the G and A represent in the DNA sequence? Is it A, sugars, B, amino acids, C, phosphates, or D, nitrogen bases? If you said D, you were correct. Let's try another question. Which of these statements best explains how genes and proteins are related? Is it A, genes are segments of DNA that code for proteins, B, proteins are segments of DNA that code for genes, C, genes are the building blocks of proteins, or D, proteins are the building blocks of genes? If you said A, genes are segments of DNA that code for proteins, you were correct. Let's try one more question. Scientists have recently discovered a new species that lives attached to the side of a tree. An organism from this new species is multicellular, has cell walls, has vascular tissue, makes its own food, has structures that absorb moisture from the air. The scientists learned that this organism produces a special protein that prevents it from freezing in cold weather. Which of these contains the information for making this protein? This is a perfect example of a strategy that I want you to utilize when taking the HSA. If you notice, the beginning parts of this question had nothing to do with the actual question of what they were asking you. In a question like this, I highly recommend always reading the last sentence of a long summary. And if you can answer the question without reading the summary, you would have been fine. This is a perfect example. Let's look at this question again. Which of these contain the information for making a protein? Is it A, a vacuole, B, a lipid, C, a vitamin, or D, a gene? If you said gene, you were correct. And one final question for you. The genetic information for making a protein must move from the nucleus to the cytoplasm. Which of these moves this information to the cytoplasm? Is it A, a ribosome, B, DNA, C, RNA, or D, an amino acid? If you said C, you were correct. Good luck, Dunlake High School, in your biology HSA. This here is the Science Source, trying to prep you for the HSA.